Morning everyone, my name's Geoff Simm. I'm Director of the Global Academy of Agriculture and Food Security, as Ellen has said. It's my great pleasure to chair this, I was going to say the first session, but we've already had one really, haven't we? So this is session 1B, I suppose, this morning. As Eleanor and David and Darren have all said, Robin has made many contributions to the science underpinning animal breeding, and it's been a delight to work with him over many years in various roles. I think in particular Robin was a catalyst in getting people in the various different animal breeding groups in Edinburgh to work together, and that was a huge contribution which we valued greatly. And more of that later. You'll hear from several colleagues who are going to give more specific examples of that. I guess what you've mainly all come here for is the stories. And I made a foolish mistake because I suggested that we should record this for posterity and for future students, which now means that most of the stories can't be told in this section. So you'll have to wait till this evening to hear most of the stories I think that you probably travelled for. One I can tell, though, is that when Robin was awarded his DSc degree here several years ago, allegedly his mother said that his brilliance was attributed to him being kicked in the head by a cow, because he's a farm boy. He was born on a dairy farm in Lancashire. And I've spent many years since then trying to get kicked in the head by a cow in the right place, but it's obviously very site-specific because it hasn't worked for me so far. So I should say also that's a very rare picture of Robin. We've seen 3 or 4 already, and for anybody under 30, we used to use phones to make telephone calls, and we used to take pictures with a camera. And Robin managed to evade both the old style and the new style, particularly the new style cameras. There's very little out there in the digital highways to capture, but this is one out of focus, unfortunately. So I first encountered Robin when I was doing a PhD at the then Animal Breeding Research Organisation. It later became part of Roslin through several other intermediary steps. And I was doing a PhD on selection for lean growth in Hereford cattle, which are now virtually a rare breed in this part of the world. I don't think those two things are connected. And Robin was a semi-willing co-opted supervisor, I guess, at that stage. So he wasn't a formal supervisor of mine, but he was a huge asset and a great help in some of the more mathematical parts of what I was doing, and in particular this paper on product trait selection for things like lean growth, where you multiply several components together. I think it might be worth just saying a word about that paper, because Patterson and Thompson gets all the glory, but I think there were sort of hidden depths to this paper that contributed to Robin's work. In fact, it appears from the citations that they remain largely hidden from most people. But it is worth another read to see if you can find them. On a more serious note, the collaboration that began then and spanned several decades, from my point of view, was hugely rewarding, stimulating, productive, and very enjoyable. And hopefully Robin will have forgotten by the time he gets to his talk and has the opportunity for a response. From the early 1990s through to the early 2000s, we worked together on quite a wide range of projects. Perhaps the largest was one to introduce blood genetic evaluations for beef cattle and on a sort of small scale sheep in the UK. And that was work we did with Naomi Ray, David Nicholson, Ron Crump, Robert Finlay. That sort of morphed into projects to develop new selection indices for beef cattle with Peter Raymer and Tim Roughsedge. And we had several students in common working on dairy cattle genetics, particularly of health and fertility traits. Roel Veerkamp, who later joined on staff, Jenny Price, Hadja Kadamardine, and collaborators at Reading University, Dick Esselmont and colleagues. And with John Williams and Beatrice Villanueva, and again another group at Reading, we began looking at the role of some new breeding technologies. And last but not least, I think Robin and several of others in Edinburgh were concerned that there was a a sort of move towards outsourcing of genetic evaluations that we thought was at risk of breaking the link between research and application, that sort of pathway to impact in practice. And that led to a bid to create more resource in the UK, particularly through eGenes, to provide genetic evaluations for ruminants. And to my mind, that's been quite a successful move for those sectors and breeds that have stayed with that. And we'll hear some more examples of that from Mike and Raf in dairy cattle. But I know that Limousin and Texel breeds in the UK have certainly made full use of that capability on their doorstep, as it were. Strangely, some of the things that stick with me most about that BLUP project are not so much the technical things, but some of the human things. The levy boards at that stage were transitioning from sort of public bodies into more corporate beasts. And it was I think for many of us, our first exposure to extreme project management. So we saw quite a few Gantt charts, and our lives became dominated by Gantt charts. And as you know, Robin's very tolerant of excessive management interventions in research and everything else. And I think my job was to try and keep everyone speaking to each other, which was quite challenging a lot of the time. Most of the project meetings were held down in Milton Keynes, and at that stage we didn't have an EasyJet connection from Edinburgh, so we used to have to fly to Heathrow. And for reasons that still escape me, the Meat and Livestock Commission used to send a uniformed chauffeur with a stretched Mercedes limousine with antimacassars on the back of the seats. These are sort of embroidered, elaborate cloth covers on the back of the seats to meet us and to, I was going to say whisk us, but we didn't get whisked very often. We sat on the M25 for a very long time, actually. Take us to Milton Keynes, where we had these stressful monthly meetings, and then we escaped at the other end and came back here to live another day. Those were fascinating times. I think we learned a lot about project management, about BLUP, about breed society politics, because what we were doing basically was introducing cross-herd evaluations for the first time in all of the major beef breeds. And there was a very major uproar usually when these results were announced, because many breeders who'd been at the top of their tree for years were no longer at the top of their tree, and we were blamed. So there was some interesting breed society politics going on there. But we also met and worked with some really switched on and motivated and inspirational breeders, people like Richard Fuller and Richard Oates, who posed some really stimulating and thought-provoking questions. And some of those, I think, led to some of the later work you'll hear about how you do deal with this trade-off between gain and genetic gain and inbreeding, because they were struggling with that sort of on the ground in trying to introduce embryo transfer schemes, for instance. Suffice to say, introduction of those methods was successful. We got very respectable rates of genetic gain in many of the major breeds for several years to come, in both beef and in sheep, although I think in both cases these are perhaps less widespread than they were at that time, and certainly some of the breeds have chosen to follow the outsourcing route after all. But for those that have stuck with the local option, I think a lot has been achieved. So that's the end of my brief introduction to this session. It's a great pleasure to introduce four colleagues who are going to talk in more detail about some of the specific contributions. And first of all, it's a pleasure to ask Brian McGuirk to talk about multiple ovulation and embryo